Hey there, I'm Danny Trester from Trester Tailor in Rochester, Minnesota. This is Tailor It Yourself. In this 4-part series, I'm going to show you how to make alterations on a t-shirt. In parts 1, 2, and 3, we narrowed the shoulders, we took in the sides, put darts in the back, shorten the sleeves, and put darts in the sleeves. In this last part, part 4, I'm going to show you how to shorten the bottom, bring the hem up. To do this, you're going to need a couple of tools. You'll need a scissors, a thread nippers or a small scissors, some thread to match your garment, a ruler, a seam ripper, or a razor blade, some wax tailor's chalk, and some pins to do your fittings. You're also going to want a sewing machine, a serger or a sewing machine that has a zigzag stitch, and an iron that can output steam. It's possible to do this process with just hand sewing, but it's not going to look as nice or hold up as well as if it would if you used a sewing machine. Welcome back to part 4 of how to alter a t-shirt. So far in this series we have narrowed the shoulders on our shirt, we've taken in the sides through the bottom and through the sleeve, we have shortened our sleeves, and we have also taken in the sleeve a little bit on the outside to address belling of the sleeves a little bit. But in this one we're going to do the final step, which is shortening the bottom. So there's a couple ways that you could do this. One is if you want just a straight hem across, you can just kind of fold it under to the length that you want, and then either use your pins to pin that length that you like, or use your waxed tailor's chalk and mark it at the bottom. Another way that you can do this is you can do a scalloped hem, or you can do a hem that's shorter in the front, longer in the back, or if you want it longer in the front and shorter in the back. For this one, I'm going to do a scalloped hem, which means it's going to be shorter on the sides than it is going to be in the front and the back. I just like this type of hem because for me, I find it a little bit more flattering and it makes my shirts a little bit more interesting. So if you find that you have a t-shirt that fits you all over, but it just starts to get a little bit too tight at the hips, shortening it just at the sides is going to allow you to keep the length in the front and the back, but it will allow a little more allowance for the hips, and also it'll just be a little bit more flattering for you. So overall, this shirt, I like the length pretty much, but I just maybe a touch long in the front. So I'm just going to fold this under just a tiny bit here, and then I'm going to put a pin there. And then for the sides, I'm going to kind of roll this up a little bit to expose the hip a little bit more. And then I'm going to put a pin in there and kind of look at it. Maybe put a couple more pins so I can get a better feel of what it's going to look like. And then I'll kind of try to do the same thing on this other side. And you can do this curve as, more severe, or you can do it more gentle if you don't want to do it, make it super noticeable. You can do whatever works for you. But for me, I just like a little bit of curve along the sides so that it is going to be a little bit shorter here along the side and in the front. And if I flip this up, I'm going to be shortening the front about, looks like maybe an inch or so. And then the side, if I unpin this and mark it, the sides I'm going to be shortening maybe about 3 inches or so. Okay, so that's all we really need to do for fitting our hem. So next we'll take it off, put it on our work table, and measure out the rest of it, mark it all the way around, and then cut the excess off, and then we'll be ready to put it back together. Alright, so we're back at the cutting table, and we'll take our shirt and turn it right side out so we can see our pins and our marks. And we're going to turn our pin marks into chalk marks. So we've got, I've already got the front one marked, so I'm just going to take that pin out. And this side I'm going to mark here, and I'm going to ignore the rest of the pins. And again, if you were just doing this straight across and you didn't want to do a scalloped hem, all you would need to do is take the measurement that you're going to shorten it by with your ruler. And let's see, we measured this, it's about 7/8 of an inch, so we would go around and measure 7/8 of an inch all the way around. front and back of the shirt, and then we'd want to measure our hem width, which on this shirt is about between 1/2 inch and 5/8. You could go a little wider, a little narrower, depending on your preference. If you're doing it straight across, you could do 3/4 of an inch. So then you would just want to mark your hem like that, your cut line there. And because we are going to be working in the area where the old hem stitching is, you'll have to remove the old hem. If you were shortening this a lot and just cutting that off, you wouldn't have to worry about that. But for the hem that I'm actually going to do, even though it's scalloped, the front I'm going to have to at least take apart because we've got that stitching there. And we don't want the 2 folds of the hem in there. It's just going to be a little bulky. Okay, so we'll ignore these marks here because we're not going to be paying attention to those. And any mark that I don't want to use, I just end up putting a little slash mark through because then I know don't use that mark. Okay, so we've got our mark in the front here, and again, that was about 7/8 of an inch. And then we've got our side mark here for where we want the side to be a little higher, and that's about 2 inches. So I'm going to maybe make that a little bit more exaggerated. I'm going to make it 2.5 just because I want to get a little crazy. So I'm going to remark that at 2.5, and then I'm going to take my other side, and I want to make sure that the length is the same because the length may be a little bit different just because of the way they make these shirts. So I'm just going to lay them side by side, lining up the seams under the arms, and then you can see how this one side is just a smidge longer. So we're going to mark it for our high mark on the other side. This side was 2.5, but this side's maybe like 2 7/8. But when we're done, the length on the sides is going to be the same. So that's kind of what we're looking at there. So now that we've got our sides marked, we're going to kind of draw out the curve of our hem. So I'm just going to kind of turn the shirt so I can, in the same flat space, see my front mark and my side mark, and I'm going to kind of draw a curving line that connects the two. So you could really measure this out and be precise, but I'm just going to eyeball it because I'm used to it, and sometimes measuring it out doesn't always have the best results anyway. So I'm going to stay mostly flat in the front and then really kind of curve up to the sides here. And then I'm going to kind of shake this out over here and kind of mimic the same thing. So I'm going to stay flat kind of through the front and then slowly taper up to that side mark. I'm going to shake this out so you can kind of see what this looks like. So if you look at the whole thing, and then I can kind of tell this is a little bit higher over here than this is over here. So I'm going to lower this part a little bit like so, and then I'm going to put hash marks through the ones that I don't want. And you can kind of see how that evens up a little bit more. So now I'm going to flip this over. And we've got our side marks already marked there. This one we'll just make a little bit darker. And I'm going to mark the center 7/8 because that's what we're doing on the front. And I'm going to do the same thing where I'm just going to draw it out. And then kind of assess my line to make sure it looks even. This side's a little low, so I'm going to go a little bit higher over here. Get rid of those marks there. Okay, so now we've got both sides marked for the shape of our hem, and now we want to account for our seam allowance. So on this original one, it's between 5/8 and 1/2 inch. I'm just going to make it 1/2 inch because the smaller we go on the sides, the easier it is going to be to make that curve, because when we show what this is going to look like, we're going to go up and around. So when you're sewing on a curve, the narrower you make your seam allowance, the easier it is to sew over that. If you were doing this on the curve and you wanted to make your hem 1 inch wide, you're going to have a little bit of problem getting that to lay flat. It's going to kind of twist up at that corner. So 1/2 inch usually works well if you're doing it on the curve. If you're doing a straight hem, you could do 3/4 of an inch, or whatever was originally on the shirt if you want to keep it looking like it hasn't been altered, keep the original look. Okay, so we're going to mark this out, and I'm going to measure a 1/2 inch from my hem line here. I'm going to flip it over, do the same thing on the back side. All right, we've got it all marked out. The next step we want to do is, if you are going up far enough from the original hem and you don't run into the stitching of that, you can just cut it off at your second line. Otherwise, as I have in the front here, we are going to be working right within where our old hem was. So we're going to need to remove the stitching from about here to here so that we don't get that second fold of where the hem was in our new hem. So we're going to have to take that apart a little bit. So I'm going to show you a little bit of a trick to take this apart. A lot of t-shirts are chain stitched because they're stitched on an overlock machine, and sometimes you can remove this in the same way they put it in, where you can clip one end and then kind of pull it out all in one thing, and it makes it really easy to take it out. Sometimes on knits it's a little tricky because the threads want to get stuck together and doesn't want to come out cleanly, and you end up just having to rip it out, you know, normally as like a normal seam. But with chain stitch seams, sometimes it can be a little easier if you can get it started. So what we're going to want to do is we don't want the hem down, we want the hem edge facing up, because usually the chain stitching goes this way if the hem is up, if that makes any sense. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take our nippers or scissors or seam ripper and kind of get in there and clip the, you know, because we don't have to go all the way, we just have to go to maybe about here. We're going to clip the threads, and then I'm going to, if you can see this little tail that forms, I'm going to pull that, and you can see how this is coming apart. But then sometimes it gets stuck and you have to clip it. Sometimes what can help is if you stretch the t-shirt and it doesn't allow the threads to loop in on themselves. This can be a little tricky to get started, but once you get it, and if you kind of pull it and pop it, some fabrics are easier than others. This one's giving me a little trouble. But if it gives you trouble, then you just pull it. All right, so this one's not going to cooperate super, but you could kind of see how I got it started there. And then if you stretch the fabric and wedge the shirt between your body and the table, and then you can kind of hold it and then hold the fabric with the other hand. You can kind of pull that. All right, now I got it going here. Now it wants to cooperate. So you can see how that just comes out. Now it's stopped again. So I'll just keep pulling it. And you can see how this is coming apart here. Okay, so I think we've gone far enough on the one side. Get our threads out of the way here. And we'll lay this flat so you can see what it looks like. The hem is released. Okay, and that's what it's going to kind of look like there. So now we'll have to release the hem on the back side as well. So we'll try to get it started with our chain stitching. But if it doesn't work, then just pull it out and just alternate taking the thread out of the front and the back. We've got our hem taken apart, and there's two ways we can proceed from here. One is if you have a serger, we can use that to cut the excess hem off and encase the raw edges. If you don't have a serger, that's okay. If you don't know what a serger, that is okay. I will explain it in a little bit. But we can also just cut that off and sew the hem back up using the raw edge. But I like to encase the raw edges or add some structure to the cut edge a little bit. So if you don't have a serger, you can also use the zigzag stitch on your sewing machine. So I'm going to do half the hem with the zigzag and half with the serger so you can see the difference. But if you're using the zigzag, you're going to want to cut your hem off before you get over to the machine. So I am going to take my side seam here and just kind of snip up to that second line, which is our cut line, and I'm going to lay this flat. I'm just going to cut along that line. There we go. And if you're doing this, you would go all the way around, but I'm going to stop at my side seam because I'm going to show you how to do it the other side with the serger. So I'm just going to cut that out of there, but otherwise you would keep going and following that line there. All right, we got this all cut and marked. Let's take it over to our serger and the zigzag stitch on our machine, and I'll show you how to finish the edges. I'm over here at my serging machine, or also known as an overlock stitch machine. If you're not familiar with this, it is a machine that can sew 3 to 4 threads at the same time, which will cut the fabric, giving you a nice clean edge, and it will encase the raw edges at the same time. So I'm going to turn my shirt inside out and then lay it under the machine on the side that I didn't cut off. The side that I did cut off, I'm going to line that up with my cutting blade because I don't want to cut that off anymore. And I am going to make sure that I follow the marks on this second row here, because that's my cut line. And because my foot is about a 1/2 inch wide and my hem width is about a 1/2 inch, I can also line up my fold marks, my hem marks, with the left side of the foot. So I'm just going to come forward a little bit, and you can see how this trims it off at the same time. So you get this clean cut and then this nice, clean, consistent stitching. And I'm going to stretch this a little bit as I go so that there's a little bit of ease in this hem and that I don't make it stiff because we don't want to pop stitches. So there's enough stretch in the fabric there. And I'm approaching my other point there, so I'm just going to kind of carefully run the blade up to the point where we've already cut it off and then run it off the machine. All right, we've got our edge trimmed off, and you can see this is like a nice clean edge there, a 1/2 inch from our marks. So next we'll take it over to the zigzag machine, and I'll show you how to do it using that. All right, now we're going to use the zigzag stitch on our sewing machine to kind of mimic the effect that the serger has, to give the cut edge a little bit more stability and keep the fabric from fraying, which It's not totally necessary on knits because they don't really fray, but sometimes little pieces of the fabric can come apart. So this is just going to add a little bit of insurance on that. So over time, it doesn't compromise the integrity of your hem. But if you don't want to do this step, you can skip it and go straight to stitching the hem back up. But the first thing we're going to want to do is test our stitch. We want something that's going to be, let's select our zigzag, as wide as we can. So about 1/4 of an inch wide. It depends on, the abilities of your machine. I know mine doesn't go as wide as my serger, so I'm just going to maximize the width, and we want about 1/8 of an inch in between the stitches. That way we have enough distance in between so that it'll be effective, but not that we're sewing all in one spot and it's going to stretch the fabric out. So we'll just practice sewing on our scrap here a little bit. And that's about what I'm looking for. I want something that's about 1/4 of an inch wide and about 1/8 of an inch in between each stitch. So I think that should work. All right, so we're going to start with our shirt inside out and with the outside of the shirt facing up towards us. And we want the needle position to be all the way to the right so that we know we've properly, we've got the needle on the fabric at the right spot. We want to place it so that the needle is just inside the edge of the fabric. If you go off this fabric, because it's a single layer, it's going to be kind of flimsy and it might roll and you might catch it on your foot. So we want to make sure that we get it inside the fabric just enough. And you might have a little trouble getting caught on the side seam here, but we're just going to push past it. You have to pull it a little bit. So you can kind of see how our zigzag is just within the edge there. It's kind of what you want. And if you can, use a ballpoint needle on your machine, especially with knits, because you can get skip stitches like I've got there, but it's not too big a deal. All right, so we're approaching our stop point, so we're going to go past where the other stitching is and then back tack. Okay, so we've got our zigzagged edge there. And you can see how that's just within just on the outside the edge there, and this is the serge side, so you can kind of see the difference here. The zigzag is just a little bit more consistent, or excuse me, the serging is just a little bit more consistent, and there's more coverage, and it also doesn't stretch the fabric as much. All right, so we've got our raw edges all finished off, so we'll take it over to the straight stitch machine and we'll sew our hem up. So we're going to turn the shirt right side out, and we're going to start at either one of the side seams, and we're going to fold up the hem to our chalk mark and line up the little seam, side seam on the hem with the side seam on the body. We don't want to get this too forward or too backward, otherwise we'll end up with a twist in the hem. So to keep it balanced, we want to make sure those seams line up there. And then we'll place this underneath the machine so that we're just within the edge of the fabric and we're lined up with our line gauge, whatever width we chose as our hem width. For me, it's a 1/2 inch. I'm a little short here because my zigzag stitching kind of pulled the edge in a little bit, but that's okay. I just want to make sure that I get within the edge so that I can actually keep the hem up. So we'll go all the way around, and at these parts that are closer to the side seams where it's more curved, sometimes you gotta pull this a little bit and get it lined up and kind of have it on a curve so that it lays a little smoother. And I'm just going to keep my needle within the edge of this fabric here and lined up with my line gauge, and be mindful of my chalk marks where that's folded. And I'm just going to continue to kind of go all the way around. And as I'm approaching my other side seam here, I'm just going to kind of lay this flat and get my seams here lined up as well. And again, my zigzag stitching pulled the fabric in a little bit, so it's not as wide as a 1/2 inch. So if I have to go short of that, that's okay. I'm just going to make a smooth transition into that, just so I can grab the edge of that fabric. And I'm going to kind of work this a little bit, because it's on the curve. Sometimes it doesn't want to lay perfectly flat, and you got to kind of work it to your mark there. So if you notice that your machine is skipping stitches at all, and you haven't done the serging or the zigzag stitch, I recommend doing so. Adding that extra stitching in there fortifies the fabric a little bit. So if you find that as the needle's going through it's not stitching, adding that in will help keep it a little smooth, as well as using a ballpoint needle, which is also important because it will help put, it won't, using a ballpoint needle won't put holes in the fabric. So if you need to undo anything and retry, you don't have to worry about holes that you'll have to repair or try to cover. And I'm approaching my start point, so I'm just going to make sure that I ease into it, and where my stitching is, I'm going to stitch up into there and then back tack a few stitches. Okay, we've got our hem sewn in. I'm going to clip my threads here, and you can see our hemline there. It's nice and consistent, and we've still got some stretch in the fabric. So you could be done with this at this point and just do a single row of stitching, but I'm going to put a second row in so you can see what that looks like. Sometimes vintage tees have double row stitching, and this will kind of mimic the look of that. You can achieve this by using the serger and the overlock stitch machine by just flipping the blade up, but I prefer to do it this way because it's just a little bit easier to keep an eye on it and making sure it's nice and smooth, but this will give you the same look. So if you had a thicker hem, you could do a 1/4 inch in between the rows of stitching if you had 1 inch or 3/4 of an inch. Mine's only a 1/2 inch, so I'm going to do 1/8 of an inch in between. So if you were doing a 1/4 inch, and every foot is a little bit different, but I know that on mine, between the needle and the left edge of my foot here is a 1/4 inch. So if I was going to do a wider double row, I would just line up this existing row of stitching along my foot, and then the 2 rows will run a 1/4 inch parallel along the hem. For this one though, I'm going to do 1/8 of an inch, so I am going to line up my existing stitch, the first row that we did, with the middle of this left foot, and then I know that I'm going to be 1/8 of an inch all the way around. So I'm going to ignore the lines of my machine, my needle, everything. The only thing I'm going to watch is that my stitch line is going smack in the middle of that part of the foot, and that will give me a consistent parallel line throughout the whole hem. So you may need to go a little slower for this. And if it's not perfect, that's okay. You can always, take it out and redo it, but because the thread is the same color as the fabric, no one's going to go look down at your hem and say, what is that? So don't be afraid that you feel like you can't redo it, or, it doesn't have to be perfect. So you can see as we go around, we've got a nice 1/8 of an inch in between. And I've got to my other side seam, so I'm just going to readjust. And I'm just approaching my other side here, so I'm just going to make sure everything's laying nice and flat, got my threads out of the way. And I'm going to, again, follow into my existing stitch line and then back tack a couple stitches. And we'll snip that off. Okay, so you can see our double row of stitching there. We've got a nice, consistent parallel lines. So we've got this all sewn up. We'll take it over to the pressing board, give it a final press, and then try it on, see what it looks like. All right, let's press our hem. So we want to kind of, we can have it right side out, and we'll do each side at a time. So we'll take our hem and kind of lay it out, smooth it out. And we'll grab our iron, and you want to use an iron with steam, put some water in it. If you got an iron that's a home iron, that's going to keep our pressing looking really nice and crisp. So we'll just kind of lightly press over that. We don't want to stretch it any more than we have to. We just really want to let the weight of the iron and the steam do the work for us. And then once we have that all situated, I like to lay them together. Kind of press the outside. This will kind of help smooth out any stretching that happens. Washing it too after you've altered it will help with stretching as well. This might be a little bit wider than we want. But my recommendation, anytime you're altering something, if you want to make further alterations, wash it first, especially if you have a lot of rayon in the fabric, which this shirt does, because rayon will respond to being washed a lot, so it will suck back up. All right, we've got this all pressed up. Let's try it on and see what it looks like. Okay, we've got the shirt back on, and we've got our hem finished, and you can see how it kind of goes a little bit higher up at the sides there. And it's just a little bit more in proportion for my torso. I don't like so much length on there, but some people want to do a little bit cropped. If you want a little bit longer, you could do whatever works for you. The method is still the same regardless of the length that you choose. But yeah, we have in this series narrowed our shoulders, we're taking in the sides, we've shortened our sleeves, we added darts to the sleeves, we added darts to the backs, and we shortened the bottom with a scalloped hem. So we've done a lot to this shirt, so it can feel and fit a lot different than when we started. The hem here has a little bit of waviness to it yet, and that's okay. That is likely because there's a lot of rayon in this shirt. And when I sew it and press it, it kind of reacts to all that. So when I go home and I wash this, it's going to kind of shrink back up and maybe lay a little bit smoother once it's done. But I think overall, it's not too tight. I got a little bit of movement yet, and I'm really happy with the result. Much better than we started, where it was big, boxy, broad, long, and there's not much shape to it. So I think this is a little bit more flattering for my shape, and I'm going to feel a little bit more comfortable and confident in everyday life. And I hope that you feel the same when you're able to do your own tailoring and alterations. That's the whole point of this series, that you feel good in your clothes and you feel confident and you just want to go out in the world, have fun. So thanks for watching, everybody. I hope you learned something. This is the last part in our series, and I hope you feel confident in tailoring your own clothes. And if you have any questions, hit me in the comments below, and I'll see you next time. For more information, including a recommended tools list and downloadable PDFs, you can see the video description below. Thanks for watching, and hope you subscribe.